The figure in the water didn't look distressed at first. Just a swimmer. Just another jogger who decided the Atlantic was calling at 5:47 in the morning when the fog still hadn't burned off Tybee Island and the only witnesses were gulls and the occasional fisherman setting lines for Spanish mackerel. Commander James Mitchell had been running the same route for 6 weeks, 3 miles north along the shoreline, a shallow water swim to cool off, 3 miles back before the heat made the asphalt unbearable. Routine. Controlled. The kind of discipline that had kept him alive through 2 deployments and would keep him alive through whatever came next. He didn't see the woman jogging behind him. Most people wouldn't have noticed her at all. 50-something, grey threading through her ponytail, moving with the steady pace of someone who'd logged 10,000 miles on pavement and sand. She wore a faded blue windbreaker over black running tights, the kind of gear you bought at Target, nothing military about it. Nothing remarkable. Just another middle-aged woman getting her cardio in before the day swallowed her whole. But Hannah Clarke scanned the beach the way other people breathed. Automatic. Unconscious. Her eyes marked the pier 200 yards north, exit point, elevated position, good sight lines. She noted the lifeguard tower, unmanned at this hour but useful if the situation escalated. She tracked the parking lot behind the dunes, the boardwalk entrance, the access roads. Every 30 seconds, her attention cycled through these positions while her feet maintained their rhythm, left, right, the motion of a body that had learned long ago that predators always marked their prey. The jacket she wore had a lining. Inside that lining, pressed against her ribs where it couldn't be seen, was a unit patch the color of old blood. Faded. Stitched in place for years ago by hands that were no longer part of her official story. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had died somewhere between Helmand Province and a civilian nursing degree, and what remained was this, a woman who ran at dawn, who worked nights at Mercy General Hospital, who gave minimal references and kept her address off the grid. The patch pressed against her chest with each stride. A rhythm. A pulse. Mitchell dove at the marked spot, shallow water, clear bottom, safe enough. The ocean that morning was mercury calm, the kind of Atlantic that lied about its depth and temperature and the way it could turn on you if your heart decided to betray you mid-stroke. The salt air smelled like rust and copper, like something ancient and indifferent to the people who thought they could conquer it. He made it 50 yards out before the first cramp hit. Not in his legs. Higher. Behind his breastbone. A pressure, not quite pain, the kind of sensation you could dismiss if you were thinking about anything other than the fact that his father had died of a coronary at 58 and Mitchell was 51 and the beach was suddenly very far away. He kept swimming. Hannah was at the 3/4-mile mark when she saw the splash. Just a disturbance in the water. A swimmer correcting his stroke or losing rhythm. She wouldn't have paid attention except for one thing, the splash was wrong. Too abrupt. Too panicked. A dog paddle instead of a freestyle, which meant someone had forgotten their form, which meant someone was in trouble. She didn't break stride. Her breathing stayed steady. Her legs didn't accelerate out of fear, they accelerated out of mathematics. Distance to water, 40 meters. Depth at the tide line is approximately 2 feet, increasing to 6 feet at the marked lane where he was struggling. Time to reach him at full sprint, 7 to 9 seconds. Time before a cardiac event progressed to unconsciousness in cold water, 60 to 90 seconds if he was in actual distress versus 40 seconds if it was a true cardiac event. The numbers calculated themselves in the part of her brain that had attended medical school and combat field surgery certification. That part was always awake now. Always counting. She ran. The sand sucked at her shoes, that particular drag of wet beach that made sprinting feel like running through concrete. Her calves burned. Her breath came in controlled pulls through her nose, never gasping, never panic breathing, the way she'd learned to breathe in environments where hyperventilation could kill you faster than the enemy. Her arms pumped in tight, efficient patterns. Every movement economical. Every second shaved from her approach was potentially the difference between a rescue and a body recovery. Mitchell saw her coming and tried to wave, which was the last coherent thing he would do before the ocean filled the space where his heart's rhythm had failed. His mouth opened. Seawater entered. His hands found nothing solid. He went under the first time while thinking about his daughter's college acceptance letter, still sitting unopened on his kitchen counter because he'd been waiting for the right moment to celebrate it properly. Hannah hit the water at a dead run, the cold shocking her system in a way that would have stopped a normal person. She didn't slow. She didn't gasp. Her body had learned to accept discomfort as information instead of a reason to hesitate. The water rose to her thighs, her waist, her chest. The current pulled at her. She swam, strong, efficient strokes that covered the distance in seconds rather than minutes. He came up the second time, coughing, his eyes wild. "Can't," he managed, which was all he got out before the pressure in his chest became the only reality that mattered and the ocean decided it had seen enough. He went under again. Hannah reached him as his hand was sinking below the surface. She'd done this before. Not with a Marine. Not on a beach with gulls screaming overhead and the sun just starting to paint the horizon in colors that seemed obscene given what her hands were about to do. But the movements were muscle memory anyway. Trained. Automatic. Her right arm hooked under his left armpit. Her left hand grabbed his wrist. She turned his body toward shallow water and began the half-swim, half-drag that was controlled enough to be effective and brutal enough to work. His body was deadweight. 240 pounds of unconscious Marine with zero buoyancy, and Hannah moving on pure technique and something that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the kind of will that forgets mercy when lives are counting on you. The water released him. The sand took him. She dragged him 10 more meters up the beach, away from the tide line, away from the possibility of his body rolling back into the ocean. Her hands were already moving to check his airway, clear the water from his mouth, establish the exact moment when respiration might have stopped. His eyes were closed. His lips had taken on a blue tint around the edges. His chest wasn't moving. She rolled him onto his side, supported his head with one hand, and ran her fingers into his mouth, checking for obstructions, finding nothing but seawater and the salt taste of his own blood from where he'd bitten through his tongue during the seizure. The beach around them was still empty. The fisherman hadn't noticed. The lifeguard tower remained unmanned. It was just her, the unconscious Marine, the sound of the waves, and the dial tone of her own heartbeat beating in her ears at a rate that would have alarmed most medical professionals. Hannah's voice, when it came, was steady. "Stay with me, Commander." She didn't know his rank. Not yet. But her fingers found the tattoo on his right forearm, a call sign, a date, coordinates from some place that made the breath catch in her throat for just a moment before she pushed it down. The coordinates matched something in her map. The date matched something she'd been trying not to remember for 4 years. She tilted his head back. She checked his pulse at the carotid artery, location, just below the jaw, lateral to the larynx, pressure gentle enough to feel the vessel without occluding it. His pulse was there. Weak. Irregular. Fluttering like a bird trapped in a box. Cardiac arrhythmia. Possibly V-fib. Possibly just fibrillation. Without an EKG monitor, she was working on assessment alone, which meant she was working on instinct, which meant she was working on a training that had cost her everything 4 years ago. She reached into the pocket of her running jacket and found her phone, waterlogged but functional because she'd paid for the waterproof case and never asked herself why someone jogging alone needed redundancy in communication. Her fingers moved across the screen. Steady. Precise. No shaking. No hesitation. 911, what's your emergency? Cardiac event. Male, approximately 50 years old, found unresponsive in the ocean at Tybee Island Public Beach. Current location approximately 200 meters north of the main lifeguard station. Patient has a pulse but irregular rhythm, possible arrhythmia. He aspirated seawater but airway is now clear. I'm performing observation only at this time. The dispatcher paused. Most people didn't sound like that. Most people called about emergencies in the voice of people experiencing emergencies. Hannah sounded like someone reporting a weather pattern. Are you medical personnel? Nurse, Hannah said, which was technically true and approximately 15% of the actual answer. ETA on paramedics. 8 minutes. Ambulance is 3 blocks away. Can you provide CPR if needed? Yes. Okay, I'm going to. Hannah ended the call. She'd given coordinates. She'd established her presence. She'd created the paper trail of Hannah Clarke, local nurse, rather than the other thing she was, which was someone whose name was inked on marine skin and whose picture probably still existed in classified photo files that would never be declassified in her lifetime. Mitchell's chest rose. Fell. Rose again. His color was still wrong, the blue around his lips intensifying, his skin taking on a waxy appearance that suggested his heart was making decisions without input from his brain. His eyes remained closed. There was no recognition, no moment where he saw her face and remembered the coordinates tattooed on his arm, no instant where the legend and the nurse became the same person. Just a man in cardiac distress and a woman in a faded blue windbreaker, kneeling in the sand with her fingers on his pulse, counting heartbeats like they were currency she was trying to save. The sun climbed. The fog burned off. The fishermen moved farther down the beach, giving the scene a wide berth because even people who knew nothing about medical emergencies understood that distance was the only useful thing they could offer. The gulls screamed. The waves continued their ancient rhythm. Hannah's eyes stayed on Mitchell's face, cataloguing every change in his color, every shift in his breathing, every second that moved him closer to or farther from recovery. 9 minutes and 43 seconds after she'd made the call, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics came down the boardwalk with their equipment and their efficiency and their eyes that immediately registered Hannah's competence in the way she was positioned, the way she was monitoring, the absence of panic in her posture. One of them, older, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of running calls in coastal Georgia, nodded to her. What do we have? Cardiac event mid-swim. Found unresponsive approximately 12 minutes ago. He aspirated seawater but I cleared the airway. Pulse is present but irregular. Possible V-fib. No responsiveness to verbal stimuli. The paramedic knelt beside Mitchell. You did a good job. We've got him from here. What's your name? Hannah Clarke. She stepped back. She'd done what she came to do. The rest belonged to the system, to the hospital, to people whose job it was to save lives within the structure of institutions that kept records and filed reports and had no use for the kind of person Hannah used to be. As they loaded Mitchell into the ambulance, one of the younger paramedics, couldn't have been more than 25, fresh from paramedic school, looked at Hannah with the kind of expression people wore when they wanted to say thank you but didn't know if the situation called for gratitude or professional detachment. You saved his life, the younger paramedic said quietly. Hannah nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't deflect. She also didn't smile. Good luck at Mercy General. Their ER is going to be crowded this morning. Tell them he'll need a full cardiac workup. She watched them load him. She watched them drive away, the siren quiet until they hit the main road and then the sound cutting through the morning like something that couldn't be ignored. Then she turned and began jogging back the way she'd come, her breathing steady, her pace consistent, her jacket zipped up tight enough to keep the unit patch pressed against her ribs. The sand pulled at her shoes. The salt air burned her lungs in the good way, the way that meant she was still alive and still functional and still compartmentalizing things that had no business being compartmentalized. Her night shift at Mercy General would start at 7 p.m. That meant she had 13 hours to pretend she hadn't just saved a Marine with a tattoo on his arm. 13 hours to pretend she hadn't recognized something in those coordinates. 13 hours to pretend she was just a nurse, just a woman jogging on a beach, just someone with nothing left to lose and every reason to keep her head down. She made it back to her apartment by 7:30 a.m. The place was small, one bedroom, kitchenette, a view of the utility parking lot that cost her $750 a month because she'd learned long ago that anonymity was worth the expense. She showered. She changed into civilian clothes. She made coffee that she didn't drink and sat on the edge of her bed with her hand pressed against her jacket, feeling the outline of the unit patch underneath. The tattoo on his arm. The coordinates matching Helmand Province, March 2014, Operation Moshtarak, the day her unit had gone into a compound that wasn't supposed to have contacts but had exactly 147 of them spread across 2 city blocks and 3 rooftops. The day she'd carried then-Lieutenant James Mitchell out of an ambush while performing field surgery on a perforated spleen with nothing but a trauma kit and hands that had learned to work on living tissue the way other people learned to tie their shoes. She closed her eyes. She didn't let the tremble happen. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was the thing that came after the adrenaline burned off, the thing that came when you realized you'd just stepped back into a past you'd spent for years trying to outrun. That evening at 7:15 p.m., Hannah clocked in at Mercy General. She went through the motions of becoming a nurse, badge clipped to her scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face arranged into the expression of someone who was neither too competent nor too interested. The evening shift supervisor, Patricia Martinez, was reviewing the board when Hannah passed. New admission, Patricia said without looking up. Cardiac patient transferred from Tybee Island Beach Rescue this morning. Commander James Mitchell, admitted for observation. Full workup ordered. He's in room 347. Hannah's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. Her face remained the empty mask of professional detachment. Got it, she said. Anything critical? Stable for now. But whoever did field triage on him knew what they were doing. Paramedics said the site was textbook presentation, airway cleared, patient positioned properly, vitals monitored. You don't see that kind of training every day. Hannah turned toward the medication cart. Lucky, she said quietly. He was lucky. She didn't go to room 347 that night. She didn't need to. She had no desire to see recognition in a Marine's eyes. She had no intention of becoming real again, of letting the legend wake up inside the nurse, of being anything other than what she'd built herself into, a ghost in scrubs, a woman with no history, a senior chief petty officer who no longer existed. The jacket with the unit patch stayed in her locker. The tattoo on his arm would remain just a tattoo. The coordinates he'd been muttering during his semi-conscious state belonged to someone else's memories now. But as Hannah moved through the hospital that night, checking vitals on pneumonia patients, administering pain medication, listening to the hiss of ventilators and the soft beep of monitors, she couldn't stop herself from passing room 347 once, just to see. He was sleeping. His color had improved. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of someone whose heart had decided to cooperate. And on his forearm, visible even in the dim light, was the tattoo with her name on it. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and something older, the particular staleness that came from 8 years of Dr. Marcus Hargrove's presence, like the air itself had learned to hold its breath around him. He stood by the whiteboard on Tuesday morning, marker in hand, speaking loud enough for every nurse within 20 feet to hear. "I'm making this official," he announced, uncapping the marker with the precision of someone used to being listened to. "I give Nurse Clarke here 1 week before she cracks. Any takers?" He wrote it across the board in thick black letters, "Clarke resignation pool." 3 residents awkwardly laughed, the kind of laughter that didn't come from amusement but from the complicated calculus of professional survival. You laughed when Dr. Hargrove made a joke because the alternative was becoming his next target. Hannah Clarke stood at the coffee machine 5 feet away, her back to him, pouring a cup with hands that moved like a metronome, steady, measured, incapable of betrayal. She'd been at Mercy General for 6 months now, and in that time she'd corrected 3 of Hargrove's diagnostic errors quietly enough that only the patients noticed. She'd stabilized a 7-month-old with suspected sepsis while Hargrove was still arguing with the mother about bringing her to the ER. She'd caught a subtle ST elevation on an EKG that his rushed review had missed. And that, more than anything, had made her dangerous to him. Hargrove had built his career on institutional connections, his college roommate sat on the hospital board, and that connection had calcified into 8 years of unquestioned authority. But authority wasn't the same as competence, and competence couldn't be argued with. Hannah turned slightly, cup in hand, and took one measured breath. She didn't turn to face him. She didn't raise her voice. "I've lasted longer in worse conditions, Doctor." You might want to hold onto that marker. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical hymn, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure. 3 residents suddenly became very interested in their charts. One nurse adjusted her badge unnecessarily. Hargrove's jaw tightened, not from rage but from the specific frustration of someone who'd tried to provoke a reaction and received only calm. She'd answered him without aggression, without emotion, with nothing he could weaponize. He filed the exchange away like a note in a patient chart. Wrong diagnosis. Worth revisiting. Thursday came with the crowded lunch shift, and Hargrove moved through the cafeteria like a man who'd decided the first stage of his plan: social attacks, public mockery, needed escalation. Stage 2 was coming. The cafeteria at Mercy General operated with the efficiency of organized chaos, 50 staff members moving through the line, trays clattering, voices overlapping, the smell of institutional meat and institutional vegetables filling the fluorescent space. Hannah stood in the food line with her tray, having finished a 12-hour shift and beginning a 4-hour break before the evening run. Her shoulders had the slight forward curve of exhaustion, not weakness, but the accumulated weight of a day spent inside other people's emergencies. Hargrove approached from her left side, moving with the calculated carelessness of a man who'd learned that accidents left no fingerprints. His shoulder caught her elbow. Her tray inverted with the physics of precise application, gravy splattered across the tile floor in arterial patterns, her plate shattered into 3 pieces, her sandwich landing butter side down like a surrender flag. 50 staff members froze. The room didn't gasp, it simply held its breath. Hargrove didn't apologize. He smiled the kind of smile that said he'd meant to do exactly that. Clumsy today, aren't we, sweetheart? Maybe you should stick to bedpans instead of real nursing. The words landed in the silence like stones into water, and what happened next was the kind of thing that would be discussed in break rooms and parking lots for weeks afterward. Hannah Clarke knelt slowly. Not hastily, not in shame, but with the deliberate motion of someone whose body remembered protocols older than this hospital, older than this department, older than the fluorescent lights bearing witness. She began gathering the pieces of her plate. And one tear escaped, real, unbidden, the kind that comes from accumulated double shifts and PTSD nightmares that came with faces she couldn't save and voices she couldn't unhear. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with his shoes, her voice dropping into a register that could cut surgical steel. I've picked up men twice your weight under enemy fire, Doctor. This is nothing. She stood, disposed of the debris into a trash receptacle with methodical precision, and walked out of the cafeteria with her back straight. Her shoes were combat boots masquerading as nursing clogs, scuffed at the heels in a way that suggested they'd traveled miles that most people couldn't imagine. Hargrove's face had gone white, not from understanding what she'd said, but from recognizing that she'd delivered a message in a language he couldn't fully speak but understood well enough to know he'd miscalculated something fundamental. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of heat that pressed against Savannah like a warning. Hargrove escalated to stage 3, strategic sabotage mixed with public humiliation. He threw Commander Mitchell's patient chart at Hannah's feet during shift change, papers scattering across the linoleum like cards from a shuffled deck. The timing was deliberate. Shift change meant witnesses. Shift change meant the worst possible moment for disruption. Pick that up, sweetheart. Your beach rescue is asking for you, try not to contaminate his room with your incompetence. But Hannah was already moving, gathering each page with the precision of someone reassembling a crime scene. No anger. No hesitation. Just methodical collection. She disposed of each page in the proper order, reassembled the chart, and walked directly toward room 347 without acknowledgement of Hargrove's existence. He watched her go, understanding that he'd tried every social tactic in his arsenal and received only calm. The anger he felt wasn't from her response, it was from the terrifying realization that his usual weapons weren't landing. Room 347 sat on the east side of the department, its window overlooking the parking lot where visitors' cars gleamed in the afternoon heat. Commander James Mitchell sat upright in his hospital bed, recovering well from the cardiac catheterization procedure they'd performed after his beach rescue 3 days prior. His right forearm rested on the bedsheet, visible in clear black ink, a name tattooed there like a prayer or a promise. SCPOH, Clarke. Hannah entered the room and saw it immediately. Her breath caught for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that existed between one heartbeat and the next, before professional composure descended like a shield. She'd learned to compartmentalize 9 years ago in Helmand Province. She could do it now. Mitchell looked directly at her face with polite blankness, the kind of expression someone wore when they were trying to place a person they should remember but didn't. "You're Hannah Clarke?" "The woman who pulled me out," he asked. She nodded, checking his vitals with hands that wanted to shake but absolutely did not. "How are you feeling, Commander?" He studied her like he was trying to solve an equation with missing variables. "Have we met before? Besides the beach, I mean. You seem." He trailed off, confused by his own instinct. The tattoo artist in Helmand Province had worked from a photograph, her face covered in dust and blood, eyes hidden behind ballistic goggles, only her name visible on her uniform stencil. He'd been sedated for most of the evacuation. The human mind has limits to what it can store, and 8 years plus PTSD had rewritten some of his memories into fragments, pieces that didn't quite fit back together. "I have one of those faces," Hannah said quietly, adjusting his fall line with mechanical precision. "Common last name too." She documented his vitals on the electronic chart and prepared to leave before he could ask more questions, before his memory could click into focus, before the careful walls she'd constructed showed even the smallest crack. But that wasn't the worst part. As she turned toward the door, Mitchell's voice followed her. "Wait. I know this sounds crazy, but—" He looked at his own forearm as if seeing the tattoo for the first time. "Why would I have your name?" Hannah's hand was already on the door handle. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. Outside in the parking lot, the heat shimmered off asphalt. "Because you were grateful, Commander. People are grateful when they've been saved." She left before he could respond, before the pieces could assemble themselves into the shape of truth. In the hallway she steadied herself against the wall, touching the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the fabric worn soft from 18 years of fingers seeking reassurance from ghosts. She hadn't expected this, that the man whose life she'd saved twice wouldn't know her. That his memory would have erased her face while preserving her name on his skin. Somehow that felt worse than being forgotten entirely. Somehow that felt like a different kind of loss. That night she sat in her small apartment staring at the metal box she kept in her bedroom closet, unopened for 3 years. The box was military standard, its contents arranged in order of service, bronze stars first, then silver stars, then the Navy Cross at the bottom like a secret that didn't want to be found. Her 17-year-old son knocked on her bedroom door around 10 p.m., his own exhaustion visible in the slope of his shoulders. "Mom, you okay? You've been quiet." She closed the closet quickly, the magnetic latch clicking shut with a sound like a lock turning. "Long shift, sweetheart." "I'm fine." She hadn't told him where she worked at Mercy General. Hadn't told anyone about her past. Hadn't mentioned that there was a man in room 347 whose forearm carried her name like evidence of a life she'd left behind in the dust of Helmand Province. Anonymity was the only thing keeping her nightmares from consuming what was left of her sleep, the only thing that allowed her to wake up as just a nurse, just Hannah, just someone unremarkable enough to disappear into the machinery of a quiet civilian hospital. She pulled her son into a hug, breathing in the teenage boy smell of deodorant and unwashed laundry, holding on to the simple physicality of being someone's mother in the present tense. Tomorrow she'd return to work and find out what Hargrove was planning next. But tonight, she just held her son and didn't think about tattoos or memories or the shape of her own name written on someone else's skin. The Monday morning golf game at Marshwood Country Club began like every other one, manicured fairways bleeding into salt marsh, the air thick with humidity and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood on the 7th tee, his golf bag propped against his hip, watching the board president line up his drive. Gerald Bancroft was a man who controlled budgets the way Hargrove controlled egos, which meant he controlled everything that mattered. "Gerald!" Hargrove's voice carried the weight of casual concern. We might have a liability issue at the hospital. Bancroft didn't look up from his ball. That new nurse. Clarke. She appeared 6 months ago with minimal references from a Virginia clinic. Now she's attaching herself to Commander Mitchell, our high-profile military patient from the beach rescue. Hargrove paused, letting the implication breathe. I'm concerned about professional boundaries. That kind of fixation doesn't develop naturally. Bancroft finally glanced at him. The moment of attention was all Hargrove needed. What are you suggesting? Background check. Thorough one. There are gaps in her employment history that concern me. Long stretches unaccounted for. The references she provided are sparse, vague. And her medical knowledge for a floor nurse, it's almost too extensive, you know? Makes you wonder where she actually got her training. Hargrove swung his club in an easy arc, not watching his shot. The ball sailed straight. Perfect form, no effort required. I'm just flagging it as your risk officer. Better to investigate now than have it blow up later. Bancroft nodded slowly, the seed planted and watered. I'll have HR look into it. By Tuesday morning, Hargrove had already made the calls himself. The Virginia clinic listed on Hannah's sparse references picked up on the third ring. Hargrove didn't identify himself as her current employer, that detail was unnecessary. He simply posed as someone conducting a routine verification for security clearance purposes, a lie so bureaucratic it required no elaboration. Any behavioral issues we should know about? His voice had shifted into the practiced cadence of institutional authority, the kind of tone that made people assume you already knew something. Instability? Gaps in employment we haven't accounted for. The clinic director, a woman named Patterson, hesitated. The hesitation told him everything. I'm not sure what you mean. Hannah worked with us for those gaps between Virginia and Savannah. They're significant. Not a question. I really can't discuss. Hargrove hung up before she could finish. The hesitation was enough. He documented it in his incident report with clinical precision, contacted previous employer. Staff member exhibited unusual defensiveness regarding employment timeline and background verification. Recommended formal investigation into hiring practices and credential verification. By Wednesday, his email to hospital risk management had materialized like a carefully constructed legal document. Recommend investigation into nursing staff member Hannah Clarke regarding 1. Unverified credential claims, 2. Suspicious employment gaps, 3. Unusual familiarity with emergency cardiac procedures beyond standard floor nursing scope, 4. Possible professional boundary violations with high-profile patient. The language was everything. Not accusations, observations. Not demands, recommendations. Each word constructed to trigger institutional response mechanisms, the way a surgeon triggers cascade reactions in the human body. Thursday morning, Hannah reported for her regular shift and found the reassignment notice on the break room bulletin board. New unit assignments, effective immediately. Hannah Clarke, Pediatric Ward, 3rd floor. The notice carried no explanation, no signature, just the weight of institutional inevitability. She found Hargrove in his office during lunch rounds, the door open as it always was during daylight hours. He liked to be seen. Power performed for an audience. The pediatric reassignment, Hannah began, her voice measured. I'd like to understand the reasoning. Hargrove looked up from his desk, his expression arranged into something resembling regret. Yes. I'm glad you brought it up. Commander Mitchell specifically requested a different care team. He let the lie sit between them like something physical. Apparently your intensity made him uncomfortable. Some patients need a lighter touch during recovery. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Her hands remained still, fingers flat on his desk. One measured breath, and the air seemed to crystallize around her. I'll need that request documented, Hannah said quietly. In writing. From the patient. It was a verbal request, communicated through his visiting officer. Hargrove's smile was the smile of someone who'd learned that the smallest untruths were the most effective because they were hardest to challenge. But I understand your concern. Professional standards and all that. You'll be much happier on PEDs. Better suited to your temperament. I understand, Hannah said, and something in those two words made Hargrove's jaw tighten slightly. She'd said them the way a naval officer might acknowledge orders understood but not accepted. She turned and left his office without waiting for dismissal. The pediatric ward smelled different, plastic toys and antiseptic and something sweeter than the adult hospital, the scent of survival measured in smaller bodies. Hannah worked the Friday shift methodically, checking vitals on children with pneumonia and dehydration, her hands steady as they always were, her charting meticulous. No errors. Nothing Hargrove could document. But that afternoon, a different nurse, Melissa, kind and gossip-prone, mentioned something to Hannah while they were pooling medications. "Your patient, Commander Mitchell? He asked about you. Wanted to know if you could stop by to talk about something. He said your name means something to him, but he can't remember why." The words landed precisely where Hargrove knew they would, because by Friday evening he'd arranged to be near the nursing station when Melissa reported the conversation to another colleague, her voice carrying the curiosity of someone who'd witnessed something incomplete. Hargrove noted it in his personal file, patient requesting continued contact with reassigned staff member. Possible relationship development. Pattern concerning. He began documenting everything now. Not just the major infractions but the minor ones, the textures of ordinary work transformed into evidence, reviewed staff members charting, 8-minute delay in documentation, 2:48 p.m. entry. Observed staff member on break, extended absence, 12 minutes versus standard 10. Overhead staff member in hallway conversation with surgical resident, content unknown but duration extended. Building architecture, brick by brick, from observations that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested the shape of a woman who couldn't be trusted. He had her Virginia references now. The clinic director had finally called him back, rattled by his initial inquiry, eager to clear the hospital's record. The story emerged in fragments. Hannah Clarke had worked there intermittently. Took extended leaves. Never explained why. Seemed to have military knowledge but always deflected personal questions. Brilliant with trauma patients. Kept to herself. Left suddenly about a year ago. No forwarding information. The gaps were everything. The silence around those gaps was more incriminating than any confession could be. Hargrove's morning ritual shifted. He began reviewing Mitchell's charts more carefully, looking for any notations in Hannah's handwriting from her 3 days of caring for him post-rescue. The beach rescue report came up again. She'd flagged potential cardiac complications in her initial assessment. Noted possible pericardial effusion. Recommended imaging follow-up. He pulled Mitchell's echo report. Normal. The follow-up imaging had been routine post-surgical imaging, not emergency imaging. Hannah's note had simply been overly cautious, the kind of thing a nervous new staff member might document to cover herself. Except she wasn't nervous. In her other notes, that careful documentation appeared consistently, precise observations, exact vital sign recordings, the documentation of someone trained to detail. Not the overcautiousness of a novice. The precision of someone who'd once documented findings in contexts where precision meant the difference between mission success and body bags. The thought surfaced and Hargrove pushed it away. Impossible. Floor nurses didn't have that background. They didn't move the way she moved, didn't command silence in a room simply by appearing in a doorway, didn't know cardiac physiology well enough to catch something a surgeon had missed. He made another note: staff member demonstrates knowledge inconsistent with nursing degree. Recommend credential verification review. By Friday evening, his file on Hannah Clarke contained 17 documented observations, each one individually innocuous, collectively painting the portrait of someone who didn't belong, someone whose background didn't match her current position, someone who was hiding something and possibly developing an inappropriate attachment to a high-profile military patient. The architecture was complete. He'd built it from air and suggestion and the strategic activation of institutional machinery. She had no way to defend herself against observations that weren't accusations, against a file composed entirely of minutes and seconds and documented absences. Hargrove filed his recommendation for continued investigation with satisfied precision. The gears were turning now, institutional machinery responding to his carefully crafted input. By Monday, HR would have requested her original credential file. By Wednesday, they'd note discrepancies. By the following week, they'd open a formal investigation. She'd probably resign before they finished. People always did when the walls started closing in. And if she didn't resign, well, he'd spent 23 years learning exactly how to accelerate that process. What he didn't know, couldn't have calculated in his careful spreadsheet of institutional power, was that every observation he documented, every lie he planted, every seed he buried in official channels would eventually grow into something that would bring down not just Hannah Clarke, but every carefully constructed wall he'd built around his own mediocrity. The code alarm exploded from room 347 at 2:14 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. Hannah heard it from 3 floors down, that specific tone that meant cardiac arrest, and her body moved before her mind caught up. She was supposed to be on stairwell duty, restocking supply carts, a punishment assignment Hargrove had engineered to keep her off the main trauma floors. But muscle memory didn't care about organizational charts. Her feet found the stairs. Her lungs pulled in hospital air that tasted like antiseptic and failure. The room was controlled chaos when she arrived, monitor shrieking, a floor nurse frozen at the bedside, another scrambling for the crash cart. Commander Mitchell lay pale as driftwood, his chest barely rising. The vital signs made her stomach drop, blood pressure 68/42, heart rate 138, oxygen saturation dropping in real time. Beck's triad presenting like a textbook case that nobody in this room seemed to recognize. Hypertension. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. The constellation of symptoms that screamed one diagnosis, cardiac tamponade. His own heart was drowning in blood. Status, Hannah's voice cut through the noise, steady as a surgical laser. The floor nurse stammered, post-op day 3, vitals were stable an hour ago. Then the monitor started alarming, we paged cardiology. Hannah moved to the ultrasound cart that someone had wheeled in, already running, already trying. The image on the screen confirmed everything her ears and eyes had told her. There, the pericardial sac distended with dark fluid, blood compressing the right atrium like a fist squeezing a water balloon. The morning rounds had missed it. Hargrove had missed it, had dismissed Mitchell's chest discomfort as post-surgical anxiety and ordered Ativan into his veins while blood pooled silently around his heart. Where is Dr. Hargrove? Hannah's hand was already moving to the needle tray. Still in clinic, I paged, his nurse said maybe 20 minutes. No. Mitchell would be gone in less than 2 minutes. Hannah could read a clock written in failing oxygenation and collapsing vessels. She prepped the subxiphoid area with chlorhexidine, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this procedure under far worse conditions, under mortar fire, under darkening skies, under the weight of knowing 5 men would die if her needle went wrong. She guided the 18-gauge needle toward the pericardial membrane, ultrasound probe steady in her left hand, feeling for the give, the moment of penetration. The hiss of air escaping as she aspirated. Dark blood filling the syringe. And Mitchell's pressure climbing, 70, 72, 75, 80. The monitor's shriek softening. His oxygen saturation rising like a bird remembering how to fly. 200 cubic centimeters of blood that had been choking the life out of him now gone, and she was pushing the syringe into a sterile container when she heard the footsteps. Dr. Hargrove entered room 347 like a man arriving at a crime scene. His eyes went from Mitchell to Hannah to the needle still in her hand, and something inside his chest seemed to collapse the same way Mitchell's heart had been collapsing. She watched his face rearrange itself, the shock dropping away, replaced by something colder. Rage that couldn't show itself yet because the patient was still technically on the monitor, still technically alive because of what she'd just done. What the hell did you just do? Hargrove's voice was controlled in the way a cobra is controlled before it strikes. That's an unauthorized invasive procedure. You have no credentials to. Cardiac tamponade. Hannah didn't look away from Mitchell's stabilizing vitals. Pericardial effusion compressing the right atrium. He would have arrested in 90 seconds. The effusion was missed on morning rounds. She turned to face him, her voice dropping an octave. He would have died. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The monitor's beeping was the only sound, steady now, regular as a metronome. Hargrove knew what she was right. His mouth knew it. His entire body knew it. What infuriated him wasn't that she'd saved Mitchell's life, it was that she'd done it without permission, without waiting for his arrival, without giving him the chance to be the hero in this room. She had stolen that from him. Worse, she had revealed his incompetence in front of the floor nurse, in front of the patient, in the permanent record that the ultrasound machine had time-stamped at 2:16 p.m. The cardiologists are en route, Hargrove said, his voice carved from ice. You will step away from that bedside immediately and report to my office. What you just did constitutes a serious breach of protocol, Anne. But Hannah was already moving, already stepping back, her hands already clean. She'd learned long ago that there was no point arguing with a man whose mind was already made up. Some battles were won by what you did. Some were won by the silence you left behind. By Monday morning, Dr. Hargrove had activated every network he'd spent 23 years cultivating. The hospital board president received a formal complaint filed through official channels, carefully worded to emphasize unauthorized procedure and reckless endangerment. An outside risk management firm was contracted. Hargrove had a contact there, a consultant he'd golfed with during a medical conference in 2019. By Tuesday, 3 staff members had been interviewed, their memories of Saturday afternoon gently shaped by Hargrove's framing into concerns about Hannah's judgment, her stability, the question of where exactly she'd come from and why her references were so sparse. The cardboard box they handed her on Wednesday morning at 9:36 a.m. contained everything she'd left in her locker, the faded unit patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining years ago, when she was still someone who needed to remember who she'd been. A photograph of David in his dress uniform, the one taken 3 months before the IED took him. Another photo of her son at 7 years old, missing his front teeth, holding a birthday cake shaped like a dinosaur. Hannah took the box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Security escorted her to the parking lot with the kind of professional neutrality reserved for people who had become embarrassing. Through the glass doors as they closed behind her, she could see Hargrove watching from his office window on the 3rd floor, arms crossed, his posture the perfect composition of a man who had just removed a problem. He'd have his version of the story ready, the unstable nurse, the one with the sketchy background, the one who'd made a dangerous call without authorization. By the end of the week, nobody would remember that Commander Mitchell was alive because of her. They would remember that Hannah Clarke had broken protocol. That was the story that would survive. That night she drove to Bonaventure Cemetery, parked in the gravel lot, and walked through Spanish moss hanging like the world's saddest curtains. David's grave was in the oldest section, beneath a live oak that had been standing here longer than either of them had been alive. She sat down on the wet grass. It had rained earlier, the kind of hard rain that makes you feel clean and broken at the same time, and she pressed the unit patch against her chest, pressing it so hard she could feel her own heartbeat through the fabric. I failed again, David. Her voice came out raw, not the composed voice people knew, but something underneath it, something that sounded like a woman drowning. I can't do this anymore. I thought if I just kept my head down, if I just helped people and didn't make noise, nobody would have to know. Nobody would have to see. But it doesn't matter. They always know. And when they do, they take everything. The rain fell harder, and she didn't wipe it from her face. I don't know how to be invisible and a hero at the same time. I've been trying for 17 years. But that wasn't the worst part. Thursday morning at 0800 hours, something moved through Savannah that made the city's air pressure change. Hannah was home in her apartment, still in the clothes she'd slept in, her phone turned off, when her 17-year-old son, the boy who'd never asked his mother about the scars on her back or the nightmares that woke her screaming, got in his car and drove to Mercy General. He'd found her medal box that morning, nestled in the back of her closet, hidden beneath winter clothes she never wore. He'd opened it with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Silver stars. Bronze stars. Ribbons that meant things his mother had never explained. A Navy cross. And beneath it all, a photograph, his mother in helm and province, covered in dust and blood, holding a rifle like she'd been born holding one. The lobby of Mercy General erupted when he pushed through the doors, her medal box clutched in trembling hands, his voice cracking as he shouted past security, "My mom, they need to see these. They need to see who my mom is." Phones came out. Security moved toward him, then hesitated. Something in the boy's desperation was too pure for them to interrupt. The hospital board president, crossing the lobby for a meeting, stopped walking. The box opened. Medals spilled across the reception desk like scattered stars. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, United States Navy." And outside, beginning at that exact moment, a sound started. Boots on pavement. Rhythmic. Organized. Growing louder. Through the glass doors, they began to appear, Marines in dress blues, rank upon rank of them, 200 soldiers moving with the practiced precision of men who'd trained for this exact kind of formation. They filled the parking lot. They lined the sidewalk. They stood in perfect ranks, and at their head was Commander James Mitchell, now in full uniform, his eyes searching the lobby like he was looking for something he'd lost and just remembered how to find. Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, the lobby doors of Mercy General burst open like a gunshot. Rain slicked the marble floors. A 17-year-old boy stood in the entrance, soaked through his jacket, clutching a metal box to his chest like it might dissolve. His hand shook. Not from cold. From something heavier than fear. Behind him, filling the parking lot in perfect ranks, 200 Marines in dress blues stood at attention. Not moving. Not speaking. Just standing there the way soldiers stand when the moment matters more than breath. The box he held was the color of old bronze, edges worn smooth from decades of hands that had carried it through wars most people only read about. Inside, pressed against velvet backing, were medals. Real ones. The kind that don't get handed out for showing up on time. He walked straight past the security desk toward the conference room where the hospital board had convened at 7 in the morning, summoned by a call they never expected to receive. His shoes left wet prints on the tile. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, United States Navy." 17 words. That's all it took. The board president stopped mid-sip of his coffee. The head of HR looked up. 3 lawyers exchanged glances that said they suddenly understood why they'd been summoned. The boy opened the medal box on the polished mahogany table and stepped back. Bronze star. The room didn't move. Silver star. Someone's breath caught audibly. 2 more silver stars. A lawyer actually pushed her chair back. Then the Navy Cross, sitting in the center like a sun everything else orbited around. Navy Cross. The medal you get for extraordinary heroism while under fire. The medal you get for pulling men from burning buildings while the bullets are still coming. The head nurse reached for the service file with fingers that trembled. Not weakness. Just the physical response to touching something sacred. She read the pages aloud, her voice steady by the second paragraph because these details demanded respect. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. 3 deployments to Helm and Province. The 2014 offensive. Combat medical training. 43 months in active theater. 32 confirmed emergency interventions under fire. Psychiatric discharge, 2015, due to service-related complex PTSD. Civilian nursing since then. She never told anyone. The boy's voice cracked on the last word. Just enough to remind the room that the woman they'd fired yesterday had raised this child alone after his father died. Had hidden her medals in a box. Had picked up men twice her weight under enemy fire and then went home to make dinner. The conference room door opened without a knock. Commander James Mitchell walked in, fully uniformed, and behind him came his SEAL team leader, a man with the presence of something that doesn't negotiate, it decides. The commander's eyes had finally remembered. 3 days on that beach hadn't done it. Her hands on his chest. Her voice in the dark telling him to breathe. Even her name on his arm, inked there years ago from a firefight neither of them had spoken about since. But standing in this room, seeing the medals she'd never mentioned, something clicked into place. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His boots made a sound on the tile like a gavel coming down. When he spoke, every word landed separately, the way men speak when they've watched people die and know words are heavier than they seem. 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor, actually, for bronze stars with Valor. Purple heart twice over. And that Navy cross. He pointed at the center medal without touching it. That's for pulling 5 men, including then Lieutenant Mitchell here, from an ambush while performing field surgery under active fire. Hands steady enough to place in 4 while rounds were hitting the sandbags. She carried 2 men out while dragging a third. Didn't stop moving until everyone was behind the perimeter. He looked at the board president directly. You fired her for being too good at emergency medicine. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when institutions suddenly understand they've been wrong about something fundamental. The head nurse closed the service file. When she looked up, her eyes had gone wet. She never said a word. 34 patients she coordinated care for in the ER during her time here. 34. No complications. No incidents. Just people who live because someone knew what she was doing. She turned to the board president. And we let him fire her for it. The board president stood up. His face had gone the color of someone who suddenly sees exactly how badly this is about to end. He looked at the door to his right, the one that led back to the administrative wing. Then he looked at the 200 Marines visible through the windows, standing in their dress blues, filmed by news cameras that had shown up about the time the lobby doors burst open. Where is she? The boy pointed. Hannah stood at the edge of the lobby, in the same scrub she'd worn yesterday, having come to pick up her final check. She hadn't moved. Hadn't made a sound. Just watched it happen. The way someone watches a storm move across water, inevitable, necessary, already decided before the sky split open. The board president walked toward her with the careful steps of a man entering hallowed ground. Behind him, the boy with the medal box. Behind him, Commander Mitchell with his eyes finally clear. Senior Chief Clarke, we need to talk about your position. She didn't respond immediately. Just looked at the boy, at the medals, at the uniform in front of her. Then, quietly enough that only those closest heard it, I need my job back. It wasn't a request. It was a command. 7 words. The composure of someone who'd ordered men into combat and brought them home. By noon, 3 news stations were camped outside with satellite trucks. By 2 in the afternoon, the hospital's legal team had initiated investigation protocols into Dr. Hargrove's personnel file. By 4 o'clock, the same security guard who'd handed Hannah her termination box appeared at Hargrove's office door with an identical one. Dr. Hargrove, you'll need to come with me. He tried to stand. His knees didn't cooperate. The board president was there, and the hospital administrator, and 2 lawyers with expressions that suggested they'd been waiting to do this since yesterday afternoon. The incident file was open on the conference table. Every complaint. Every call he'd made. Every reference he'd poisoned. Every move designed to push out a nurse who was simply more competent than he was. You investigated a Navy Cross recipient for being too skilled at emergency medicine. The board president's voice was quiet. Quieter than thunder, but with more damage. You saw her hand save a man's life and filed a complaint about her background. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out because there was nothing to say. The mathematics of his own destruction were too clean, too simple. He'd tried to eliminate someone exceptional, and in doing so, he'd created exactly the paperwork that would destroy him. Your medical license remains valid, one of the lawyers said. However, the hospital board has voted unanimously to terminate your employment, effective immediately. We'll be filing a report with the state medical board regarding your personnel decisions. I believe you know the way out, sir. The security guard held out the cardboard box. Hargrove walked out through the lobby while staff members lined the corridors. No one met his eyes. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that's louder than screaming, the silence of people who'd watched him and now understood what they'd been looking at all along. Just a man with institutional power and no actual skill, finally exposed. Outside, the Marines were still standing in formation, filmed by every camera in Savannah, watching a doctor get escorted from a building by security while a 17-year-old boy held his mother's medals up to the morning light. 6 months later, Hannah ran Mercy General's emergency department. Not as a nurse. As the director. Her office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the admission bays, and on the wall beside her credentials, mounted in a professional frame with museum-quality lighting, was the faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining years ago when she was someone else, somewhere else, doing things that most people would never understand. Commander Mitchell's recovery was complete. He'd returned to active duty but spent weekends in Savannah attending a PTSD support group that Hannah co-facilitated for veterans transitioning to civilian healthcare. They didn't talk much about Helmand Province. They didn't have to. The silence between them held everything. Her son received his military academy acceptance in March. Mitchell stood as his official sponsor at the commissioning ceremony, telling the assembly about a senior chief petty officer who carried 5 men to safety and never mentioned it once. 1,400 people applauded. The boy stood in his new uniform, understanding for the first time that his mother's quiet wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need announcing. Dr. Hargrove taught CPR certification courses at Savannah Community College for minimum wage. His medical license was valid but useless. No hospital would hire him. No credible medical institution would touch his name. He'd had institutional power once. Now he had nothing except the knowledge that he'd been dismantled by the truth, which is a specific kind of ruin. Hannah saw him once in a grocery store in August. He turned and walked down another aisle. She felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just the quiet knowledge that competence outlasts politics, and character is the only institution that actually matters. On the 1-year anniversary of the beach rescue, Mercy General unveiled the Clarke Veteran Nursing Initiative. 50 veteran healthcare workers now staff the hospital. Hannah stood at the podium in her dress blues, first time she'd worn them in 5 years, and kept her speech to 3 sentences. Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just looks different. These nurses carry more than medical knowledge. They carry responsibility. That's what we hired. That's who saves lives. The crowd included her son in his academy uniform, Commander Mitchell with his unit, 24 Marines who'd come just to stand in the room where their senior chief was finally acknowledged, and a young Marine recently hired to the ER who'd approached afterward with nervous eyes asking for advice. Hannah touched the unit patch pin now affixed to her civilian scrubs and smiled. Stay competent. Stay humble. The rest works itself out. Outside, someone had updated the veteran parking sign to include her name. Not in pencil. Engraved in brass. Permanent. The kind of monument you leave for people who've already given everything. Like what you just heard. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value? We read every single comment, and your story might be featured in our next video.